Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's Common Ground. I'm Malva Kachali, Special Projects Associate here at the Rail, and today I have the pleasure and privilege of welcoming Adele Bertei and Luc Sante to the Zoom stage for a conversation on music and memory and so much more. They'll be joined by our very own Bob Holman, who will be performing double duty today as both our host for this afternoon and poet to close us out. So Bob, thank you for your service in advance. We've started out all our events here with two important acknowledgements. The first is that here in New York, we're on Lenapehoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and the Shinnecock Nation. The second is an acknowledgement that Black Lives Matter. And I will say the heart of both these acknowledgements is a commitment to the liberation of the oppressed and solidarity for all those who struggle for freedom, in recognition that when it comes to our liberation, our histories never unfold in isolation. In that spirit, I encourage you all to check out the chat for a living document of resources and actions as we do our part in undoing and addressing these legacies of injustice. But we'll get right into it. Now it's my honor to welcome our wonderful host for the afternoon. We're joined by the fantastic Bob Holman, American poet and poetry activist who's been closely aligned with the oral tradition, spoken word, and slam poetry. He was famously described by The New Yorker as the postmodern promoter who has done most to bring poetry to cafes and bars since Ferlinghetti. Bob Holman has two new books, I should mention, that have come out very recently, The Unspoken and The Life Poem, and both were written 50 years apart, and yet they reach us in the same year. So excited to have you, and Bob, take it away.
Thank you so much, Malvika, and thank you, Brooklyn Rail, and thank all you people for showing up here once again in the Zoom room. And I couldn't be more honored than have these two great writers, two of my favorite people, to be in conversation. It was their conversation. I might have even suggested to Adele that she have a written conversation, or maybe she suggested to me, whatever it was, their conversation in writing should be live, I thought. And so we went to Fong and boom, here we are. And I'm now going to do the introductions. I'm going to do the introduction, and then I'm going to introduce the two of them. And then I'm going to get the hell out of Dodge, as they say. I'll be here, don't worry. Almost everything of interest in New York City lies in some degree of proximity to music. If you're in your teens or 20s, and who isn't, pretty much everything you do, apart from your day job, has something to do with music. These words, near the beginning of Luc Sante's amazing new book, Maybe the People Were the Times, are a great way to get this rock rolling. We are here today, or as, who was that? Reverend Pedro. It was Reverend Pedro. We're gathered here today because we're not gathered anywhere else today. And we're gathered here today to do the impossible, to use words to begat music. Begat. You can tell I worked a long time on that verb. Words begat music, which ain't chronologically true, but I'm talking birthing ekphrasis in opposite direction here today. You don't want to say that Adele Bertei and Luc Sante's written words are music, which is different from how poetry becomes music. Thank you, Kedrick Lamar, Captain Beefheart, Kay Tempest, Jane Cortez, happy 80th birthday to Bob Dylan, nor the way that words recall music. It's much closer with these guys than that. It has something to do with the soul you live in and the way the words of these two one-of-a-kind artists have the ability to both have you hear the song as they speak of it, but to relive that song's totality in your own life as you ride their memories and almost be able to recreate that experience even if you've never even heard the song. Does that make sense? As much as words can work, I think so. I don't know, although it would be fine for you to right now put on the Paragon's Florence or LaBelle doing Lady Marmalade, which is what I did when I was reading Maybe the People Were the Times and Why LaBelle Matters, Adele's most recent book, unless Peter and the Wolves is more recent. Which one is it, Adele?
Why LaBelle Matters was the most
Okay,
recent.
Why LaBelle Matters we're doing here today. At any rate, in the genre of words, soul, music, that's, I guess, what I'm calling this genre, words, soul, music. I want to mention two other books before we move forward. This is my footnote in the oral tradition. Banger's book, Griot Time, where you get a crash course in West African griotology as Banning learns guitar riffs sleeping on the floor in Bamako. And David Henderson's terrific biography of Jimi Hendrix, where Henderson renders Jimmy's guitar solos into prose. Renders, there's another for us. Rendering music into prose. Adele Bertei, whose perfume is l'essence du punk, essence of punk, spent most of her teenage years incarcerated and first sang gospel with the Blossom Hill, Ohio Girl Choir. Her book, Peter and the Wolves, tells the fast, tragic tale of her mentor, Peter Loeffner, whose band, The Wolves, and this is where you can cue Cinderella Backstreet, cue Per Ubu doing Final Solution, with whom she collaborated on everything from music theory and crazy dancing to finding her own voice, queerness, and heroin. And he got her to New York, where she fit right in with James Chance and the Contortions, Brian Eno, forming the Bloods, considered the first rock and roll band of gay women who were publicly out, and who opened for The Clash. Then she wrote songs for the Pointer Sisters, Sheena Easton, Thomas Dolby, Arthur Baker, Jellybean Benitez, the Nubian Lights, Lydia Lunch, Matthew Sweet, sang backup for Culture Club and the Passions, Tears for Fears, Debbie Harry. Now she lives in LA, still the most activist in the music biz, and she gets Greg Tate, Nikki Giovanni, and Lenny Kravitz to blurb why LaBelle Matters. Now you know everything. She says flat out that LaBelle sang the opening aria of Afrofuturism, which we're thinking here, folks. We're using this stuff. And then she goes on to proclaim Toni Morrison an Afrofuturist, and goes on to say LaBelle's carnal sonic combustion on Lady Marmalade brought a New Orleans hooker into nearly every home, club, and corner shop around the world. Americans learned to speak their first words of Francais funk courtesy of LaBelle, some unaware they were reciting an invitation to se faire baiser via Voulez-vous coucher avec moi ce soir? Patty, Nona, and Sarah channeled Lady M's erotic ferocity in the spirit of Ralph Ellison's Change the Joke and Slip the Yoke, blowing up the racist Jezebel stereotype by flaunting their sexual agency with the roar of a three-headed lioness. Don't give me a break. That's what I say. And now I get to introduce Luc, and then we'll have these two forces. Here's a question for you trivia buffs in the chat box. How did these two guys meet? Answer, obviously, working at the Strand. I just didn't want to give you a chance to answer in the chat box. I should have said, and now answer in the chat box, and I'll come back after the introduction of Luc, whose work I first ran into with Low Life, Lures and Snares of Old New York, which is still the go-to to see the palimpsests of our fair city, and gives me the ability to say things like, oh, I opened the Bowery Poetry Club in 2002. It's right across the street from CBGB, not from John Varvatos. He's a writer, stylist, American instigator, possesses one of the great comic voices since Mark Twain. I'm not name dropping. Born in Verviers, Belgium, Sante migrated to the US in the 60s, attended Columbia, but due to several incompletes and outstanding library finds, he did not take a degree. Back in the day, in this case, the late 70s and early 80s, he wrote lyrics for the Adele Byzantines, whose spelling I have always adored. Post-No Wave band, worked at the New York Review of Books, first in the mailroom, then as assistant to Barbara Epstein, an amazing mentor whose elegy in this new book is so smart and moving that you feel like you just met her. He later worked as a proofreader at Sports Illustrated until proofreading and the corporate gravy train came to a halt more or less simultaneously at the dawn of the present age, early 90s. He's taught at Columbia, New School, and now at Bard, where he teaches photography and the history of teaches writing and photography, including the great course, Photographing the Invisible. And yes, he is or was a musician, playing the drums for the proto-new wave band, The Flags, an outfit whose only live show consisted of them playing the same song, LKJ's, Linton Kwesi Johnson's, All We're Doing Is Defending 3 times in a row. Can't do better than that, except when Sally goes round the roses to declare it an ovoid mystery, or when the Maytals, like a slinky that goes up the stairs as well as down, break in, or at the moment where One Nation Under a Groove finally takes over from that Bavarian barroom drinking song. Nothing can happen that we don't know about it at least a week in advance. That's the way it was. And here's the way it is. Conversation, Adele and Luc.
Thank you so much, Bob. That was really a delicious intro. Blushing here.
Thanks, Bob.
Yeah. I thought a really great way to lead us in is to have Luc read a little from maybe the people would be the Times. There's a chapter called Bass Culture, and he does this incredible tracking shot of the Lower East Side in the EV when we were running the streets. So Luc, would you like to read a little bit for us?
Why, sure. And actually, the model on the experience was actually in Brooklyn.
Okay.
So this is 1981.
Which was before Brooklyn was Brooklyn, I want to bring up.
Yeah. Music is ambient throughout the city. It is everywhere, whether you like it or not. A song will come on WBLS as you're climbing the stairs from the subway station, and you'll catch it on a radio playing in a passing car, picked up by the outdoor speakers at a bodega, continued by a boombox hefted on the shoulder of somebody going the other way, resumed by another boombox in the basket of a bicycle weaving in and out of traffic, concluding in the pizza parlor you've just entered for a slice.
So good. It's so good. I think we want to talk a little bit about the emotions and memories of music. And I think that in the East Village, that was happening too, Luc and Bob, don't you think?
Oh.
Like you'd be walking down the streets, there'd be boom boxes, something coming out of windows, car radios. And it was kind of like this ecstatic feeling of like, you couldn't help but like, everybody strutted to the beat in a sense. You know, it was like we were all dancing in the streets. It was just such an incredible, I know I'm waxing nostalgic a little bit, but it really was exciting.
The speakers in the cars were getting better too, so you could hear it better. You know, I'll never forget the moment where the speakers in the cars became the equivalent of what we had listened to at the Fillmore East. Same decibel.
Yes. But go ahead.
I was going to say this was happening not just in Youthville, but like everywhere in the city, Midtown, you know, because wherever you went, there were people with boom boxes and cars, their windows open, stuff like that. It was, you know, music just permeated the whole city.
Bicycles with boom boxes, rollerbladers with boom boxes.
Yes. I just wanted to read a tiny little bit from Peter and the Wolves about my first experience of jazz, which I had listened to jazz before, but it had never really kind of enveloped me in the way that it did in this particular experience. I went to visit New York for the first time with Peter Lochner, and we stayed at Lester Bangs' house. So that was my indoctrination to New York City, Lester Bangs. We're at Lester's apartment. Lester stood up, a bit wobbly, and swept his arms out in a grand dramatic arc announcing, "Your jazz education begins here and now." Mingus spent some time in the Nut House previous to writing this suite of songs, written as a ballet, Lester emphasized. And if you listen carefully, everything you'll ever need to understand about jazz is right there within those grooves. And as the guys nodded off, I stood at the window looking out over 6th Avenue and the New York night, not wanting to miss one movement, one note of Mingus, from solo dancer to duet to group, thinking of the possibilities these boy men were unselfishly exposing to me. I felt a strange rush of fear at being in love with it all, the colors, their words, this music, the horns sounding like so many yellow taxis, cymbals, and the night shimmering out there as I imagined lovers, mothers, drug fiends, workers, runaway kids, ghosts from every corner of the world walking this avenue below me, stepping in time to a ballet, a vision in Mingus's head. And in that moment, my soundtrack to the city. A conviction of notes informed the dreams of the men who dozed near me, each interior network of blood and bone, humming with music, always with music. Music is everything, you know. It really is. What are some of your earliest memories, Luc? Like the first songs as a child that kind of exposed you to the power of music?
For me, because I grew up in a media poor environment. We just had a radio, and it was usually news or sports. So for me, it really had to do with the religious music. I especially remember attending the ceremony of the rogations, which was the blessing of the fields, and the priest moving through, and this antiphonal chant going through all the saints in Latin, Sanctus Ioannis, and then everybody would respond, Ora pro nobis, pray for us. And it's that repetition thing. There wasn't a melody, you know. And then I didn't really hear music until I was like 8. I mean, you know, popular music, that kind of thing.
Yeah, for me, it was Maria Callas on Ed Sullivan when she did Vici d'Arte, and I must have been 2 years old, and my mother would remind me that I would go into conniption fits and try to put my little hands on the screen. I was just so enthralled at the power of her voice, just pierced me.
Wow.
Yeah.
And you absorb that into the fiber of your being.
I guess so.
I remember the first 45 I ever bought. And this was in Cincinnati, Ohio, where I was taking a field trip from Kentucky. And I guess I was 6 or so. But the record store in those days, you know, all the records were loose. And as I recall, now that couldn't be true, but there were no cover. There was a green generic cover that was that all the 45s got put into, and you'd listen to it first before you'd buy it. And they had listening rooms, or you could listen in the big room. But it was The Lion Sleeps Tonight. So you can tell everything from that, right? So that was, you know, that's my story of first music before I was part of the Les Chanteurs, which was our high school singing.
Do you guys remember the record I Only Have Eyes for You by the Flamingos?
Oh God, yes.
Oh no.
I used that record actually as the introduction when I did a version of Jane Bowles' play at the Jumping Bean. I don't know if you know this little piece of hers. Such a great writer, but it was the perfect lead-in to 2 loser loner lovers at a cafe in New Mexico someplace, where everything you ordered came with a jumping bean, a free jumping bean, right down to Cokes.
I wrote about that song in my book, The Factory of Facts, because for me, listening to that, I was teleported back to walking in Manhattan with my parents in about like 1962. And that effect of the sun just sitting on the horizon at the ends of the Midtown streets over New Jersey. It was just like, and the people, and I brought back the whole thing. It was like some kind of psychedelic. Yeah, that's a great one. Is that one of your first?
It's one of my, I mean, it sounds so spectral, that record.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
like ghosts are filling the air, you know? I mean, it's just very swoony. I remember that as being very powerful, you know?
Yeah.
And also, you know, like growing up with the Beatles and the Stones and Aretha Franklin and, you know, Sam Cooke. I mean, my gosh, the music was so brilliant back then.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a real emotional and racial integration on the charts as well then.
Mm-hmm.
In that,
That's right.
and then it kind of started getting political in the 60s, which also confirmed the power of music to me.
Mm-hmm.
When, you know, Dylan and people like Odetta, of course they didn't really play Odetta on the radio, but you know, there was so much good music happening in the 60s, political music that really brought people together in community, which is very different today. We don't hear, there is political music being made, but you're not going to hear most of it on the radio, you know. They've learned.
And for us at our age, I mean, we grew up in the 60s and popular music was the dominant art form of the 60s. Let's not kid ourselves about anything else.
Yes.
And by the early to mid 70s, when we were on, you know, the cusp of adulthood or something, the music had gotten swamp-like, pretentious, overbearing, and it just had lost that initial punch, that communality, the sensation of heads exploding all over the world. So we wanted to bring it back to its foundations, you know, just strip it down to its essential parts and start all over again. And that was the impulse behind this thing that gets called punk now, but what does that mean anyway?
Yeah, music in the Lower East Side in the day, right? It was so exciting because the no wave scene started in the late 70s, like around 76, 77. And, you know, I always think of no wave as the free jazz of rock and roll because it was like anything goes. And like bands like Mars were really the project, the people that kind of launched it. With
Who was the drummer? Who was that woman drummer there for Mars?
That was Nancy Arlen, was the drummer, and Connie Berg was the guitar player. And she basically started a whole a scene of women starting to play slide guitar, but it more in a rhythmic, cacophonous way. Yet it had its own, you know, patterns, and each person that played that way, like Lydia Lunch, Pat Place. And it was also such an exciting time because women were coming from all over the world doing art, doing music. There were, you know, Lizzie Mercier from France, Ikwe Mori in DNA, the Malaria, the girls from Berlin, so, but also artists. So it was such a fecund scene of creativity, and you could live on a dime. So people were making music, and we could live by making music, which is astonishing when you compare it to today and how musicians have been stolen from. But what were your experiences of that time? What do you remember best about that time, and also the women contributing to that scene during the late 70s?
Well, I mean, for one thing, you know, punk was great. I mean, one of my crank ideas, by the way, is that punk never came to New York at all, except for the Dead Boys. Everything else was either proto or post, you know. It's like punk is something that happened in London and LA and, you know, but not New York. Anyway, that was great fun, you know, all the CBGB bands. But when you showed up and the Contortion started, I mean, and then the other no wave bands, suspend those for a minute. I mean, the Contortion specifically were so great because they brought in R&B. You know, this was music you could actually dance to I mean, the other stuff you could pogo to, but you know, is that really dancing? I remember going to a party in San Francisco in 1979 and seeing a whole room full of people where the couples were dancing with hands around each other's throats, which was like a London punk move, and I'd never seen it in life, you know.
That's like Apache dancing, Luc.
Yeah, yeah.
Apache dancing in Paris. Yeah, go ahead.
And also, I mean, the no wave thing was like the most radical distillation of punk, because these bands would include like virtuoso musicians alongside people who just picked up their instrument the day before, and most of whom were artists and thought visually and translated visual concepts into music slash noise. And it was just this great opening up, and everybody in the scene was a freak of some kind, you know, because everybody had been, you know, nobody would have made a good 60s pop star, you know, because they were, you know, women, gay, or just plain, you know, introspective weirdos. And you know, we all had this room to experiment in, because nobody, I mean, you got paid for playing music, but let's mention that these fees were minimal because our expenses were minimal, so they matched. Nobody was going to get rich off this stuff. All these records were issued by, you know, the team of Terry Ork and Charles Ball on the one hand, you know, in very, very limited editions under various names. It was not a nationwide phenomenon, you know, probably, I mean, there were people in Cincinnati who were catching up with this stuff, but they had to do it all by correspondence, you know. It wasn't being played on the radio anywhere on earth. And yet, you know, there was this teenage telegraph where we just knew about things. I still can't account for a lot of that. You know, how did we know to pick up this record at this time when it hadn't been reviewed anywhere? And it was just chain of talk. And that's something that, you know, the internet is kind of obliterated, I guess, unless it's like there's still a current of talk that I'm not aware of, being geriatric, you know.
Well, it comes back to the street again, too, that spontaneity of the street that you also talk about in Maybe the People, is that, you know, you'd be going down the streets and someone would say, hey, we're going over here to listen to this band, and we're all listen to this record. So we were all turning each other on constantly to new musics, new works, and it had that spontaneity, that street vibe, you know, which doesn't really happen anymore. It seems like, you know, in our culture today, we're very interested in categorizing and defining things and looking at our phones when we're walking down the street, as opposed to looking at each other.
Still, who knows what happens beyond our, you know, our ancient eyes. You know,
Yes,
we're
exactly.
not in the trenches anymore, so we can't really tell what goes on there.
That's true. I'm sure lots of things. But also, just to touch on this as well, it seems that sexuality was a lot more fluid in those days as well. What do you guys think about that from our time?
Well, that's true. I mean, you know, so it was an interesting time because, you know, I mean, when I started college, I got hit full blast by women's liberation and gay liberation, you know, and I mean, not that those two had not pre-existed, but I'm talking about 1972. So it was like kind of the dawn. All these people, first year of college, declared themselves gay to me. And this had never happened, even though I went to a high school where like 40% of the students were gay. Nobody ever said so. It was not, you know, and women, you know, and I'd gone to, you know, I went to a boys Catholic high school. So I'd missed out on the female conversation for so long, and women were just out to chart their own courses all of a sudden. And younger women were less ideologically rigid, you know. I mean, they wore all kinds of clothes, and it wasn't like about like restricting the male gaze by wrapping yourself up in something shapeless. There was, you know, and downtown, I mean, which was, you know, we can't stress this one enough. I mean, it was just a playground. Yeah, people lived there, but it wasn't being covered by the media. We were safe in our own space. So all kinds of people got to act out in ultra dramatic ways. And one of these things was like sitting on a stoop on St. Mark's Place between 2nd and 3rd, between, you know, like when dusk started falling until late into the night. And you'd see people you might never see again swan by in these incredible outfits that, you know, and then that became their star turn and they might disappear and back into their rabbit hole. But it was fashion parade, and not anybody's idea of fashion outside the neighborhood. You know, it was self-created totally.
Yeah, it was like anti-fashion, you know, because
Yeah.
everybody kind of played to their own like inner lives, their idiosyncrasies. So, you know, you'd have one woman dressing like somebody out of a French, you know, new wave film, and another, you know, like me dressing like a pimp from 1970. So, you know, it was just, it was so creative and so exciting to see everybody's character peeking out in these ways, you know.
Yeah,
What did you,
everybody was acting in a movie,
yes.
and we were all in different movies, but they somehow blended together. They were all in black
Yes.
and white to begin with. Yeah.
Right, right. It's true. It's true. Um,
Everybody was acting in different movies. That's perfect for those days. Um, and I'm thinking about Adele. When you walked into that one bar and saw this woman dressed like as a femme fatale, or I don't know how to describe. I think it was Nan. I don't know, but but the way you go through this consciousness shift via fashion, via personality, via the fact that this person was taking photos of you. I mean, that's an economy that I don't see much anymore. It's sort of like the digital, even though there was a camera, I guess maybe that is a precursor of digital. I don't know, but that moment from you, through you to me was just amazing.
well, yeah, I have to say that Nan Golden really influenced me substantially in terms of how to see myself with less shame being a queer woman, by looking at her photographs, which are just astoundingly tender and beautiful, but also how to look at art, how to relate to art. And the first moment I saw her, she was unlike anybody I had ever seen. She looked like a 1940s gun mall, you know. She was absolutely enthralling. And I do write about her in the book substantially, the Peter and the Wolves book. But yeah, it was like you know, being queer in the 1970s was no picnic. We were all closeted, and you know, we were beaten up, shamed, and it was really, really, really difficult. And yeah, Nan helped me be able to embrace my authentic self outside of that shame. And you know, when I moved to New York, of course, she ended up moving to New York as well. And there was kind of about 100 and maybe 100, 150 people downtown, and we all knew each other, and it was kind of this tribe. And
We're all
we were
starring in different movies.
all starring in different movies. And, you know, some of us were like embracing kind of a brutalist kind of music, and others were making films. And I mean, it was just so, so rich with creativity. And a lot of it had to do with the economics, you know, the economics of the city. You could live for nothing. I don't know where
Housing was fluid, let alone sexuality.
Yes.
The other thing, you know, about the, you know, integration of social groups together was dancing. And that wasn't, in fact, it didn't really happen at all at the Lower East Side for the longest time. I mean, dance spots were in West Village and Midtown, Upper West Side even. I mean, for me, I had my closest friend was gay. I'm not. And started taking me to gay discos in 1973, beginning with the original Limelight on Sheridan Square, which had been New York's first photographic gallery.
Wow.
And then it was a gay disco. Then it shut down, and then the name was taken for that place further uptown that opened in the 90s. Yeah, so at first it was gay discos, and then eventually, you know, we'd start trying to go to the salsa clubs, the Corso Ballroom and stuff where we couldn't dance at all, and these a few reggae spots, you know, and then I mean, I got taken to the Loft once, which was the ultimate. That was just. This was a private place. You had to have an invitation or be brought in by somebody. And unlike any other dance club in the city, it was air conditioned. And they didn't serve liquor, but sometimes they, you know, spike the punch bowl with a little bit of LSD. And it was basically people kept dancing. You know, I think I left at like 9 a.m. and people were still going strong, you know. And, you know, these things brought together entire demographics, really. I mean, because on any of these dance floors, you'd see a racial mix, you see a gender mix, you know, because, you know, the gay discos were not discriminatory against women at that point. It was a communal experience. You'd be, you know, just like throwing yourself out of your body, surrounded by other people who were doing the same. So suddenly you had this link, no matter how different you might be from one another. And that was an important tool of transmission, I think, for years.
Oh, totally. It was very physical. It was a very physical scene.
Yeah.
Luc, could I, you know, like there's such great writing you have, and maybe the people about dancing, the actual moves, the strutting that is a verb you use. I don't know if you have anything handy that you could read from that, but I'd love to hear it. And while you're getting that, I'll tell you about the time I got invited to the Loft. And that was because I can't remember the name of the guy who was the costume designer for The Cause of Gravity, a play that Bob Rosenthal and I wrote in early 70s that was done at the 13th Street Theater. But this person did these amazing costumes. And as a trade, the whole cast had to go to the Loft and blow up balloons. We were the balloon blower uppers. And since we were blowing them up when people were coming in, we were just there and got to hang out for the rest of our lives, or whatever it was. I don't know.
Nice.
Well, Bob, funny you should mention that. I happen to have something right here. This is talking about a once a week dance club that opened in an upstairs loft on Broadway on Thursday nights, called Isaiah's. We went there for the bass and the trance state resulting from hours of dancing to rhythm that stretched forever. The groove, a fabric of stacked beats, fractally splitting into halves of halves of halves of halves. A tree that spread its branches through the body, setting the governor beat in the torso, and shaking its tributaries outward and down through shoulders, elbows, hips, knees, feet, so that you couldn't stop except when you collapsed.
Beautiful. Wow. I love your physical writing about music. It's incredible.
Well, thanks. It is a physical thing.
It sure is.
So another fashionista change for you, Adele, was when you saw your first LaBelle concerts and went out to the alley afterwards. I bet you don't remember that story.
I do. Oh boy. Yeah, I mean, they played a little theater called the Allen Theater in Cleveland, which is kind of like a little jewel box theater. And Vicki Wickham, their manager, made sure that for that Lady Marmalade tour, that the Nightbirds tour, that they always worked in a theater that either had a hydraulic lift or where you could suspend people from wires. And, you know, I can't remember how old I was just a baby. And here they come descending on wires, you know, with these wings and space suits and like avian space creatures. I mean, it was absolutely incredible. they were the first women to do what Bowie introduced into rock and roll, was just this theatrical extravaganza, you know, combined with this music that was political, sexual, so passionate. Their singing, no one had ever sung in harmony with that ferocity, that I call it a rage of love, you know. Yeah, it was an extraordinary experience for me.
How about after the show and you in the alley? That's what.
Yeah, I went out to the alley because I was just so enamored, and was standing there when they came out to get into their limo, and just to say, oh, I love this show. And Patty looked at me, she goes, are you a boy or a girl? And I said, both. And they just started laughing. So I guess I was one of Patti LaBelle's glitter bugs, dressed like Bowie with glitter and a red mullet and the whole 9 yards. But absolutely loved LaBelle. I first heard them with the Laura Nyro album, the Gonna Take a Miracle record, which is still
everybody's desert island list.
Oh my God. That record just was so astonishing.
Not to take away from LaBelle, but just a little anecdotal footnote. That story about Patti LaBelle in the alley reminds me of when I took you to a dinner for William Burroughs, and I think like 78 or something like that. And he was convinced you were a boy at first, and when informed otherwise, and he was like roaring drunk. So all night long he'd shout, "La femme imposteur!" You know, I'm not doing it right because I can't do a St. Louis accent. But
St. Louis French accents.
I thought it was Le Faux Garçon, the fake boy.
No, it's La femme imposteur. You know, because imposter. Yeah, right.
Yeah, I was so intimidated by Burroughs. I sat next to him and I had on this little boy's flea-bitten suit. My hair was about that long. And someone handed me a jam jar with naked women on them with a drink in it. And I was acting all tough, you know, and I didn't know what to say to him. I was just completely speechless. I was so intimidated. Yeah.
Yeah.
Was that in the bunker? Where was that?
That was at a party at a filmmaker's place, wasn't it?
It was Howard Brookner who made the Burroughs movie. Howard,
right.
He had a place on, it was a place on Bleecker Street that was two apartments with a literal like brick hole, you know, hole in the brick wall, like a Wile E. Coyote hole that connected the two apartments.
Yeah, that's where you'd have to sneak through a lot of those holes when you were doing heroin in the East Village.
Yeah.
Okay, where are we?
Yeah, really.
Let's see. I wanted to ask, what did I want to ask? There's something on my mind about you, Luc. Did you, I think at one point you did some kind of workshops with the incarcerated, or?
I've done a few things at Greenhaven through, I teach at BARD and the BARD Prison Initiative, which has been going on for like 25 years.
I helped start that, by the way.
What's that?
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
Oh, Bob, yeah.
That was when I was teaching at BARD.
Right.
Anyway, I haven't done this a lot, but you have.
Well, I did work with Wayne Kramer's organization, Jail Guitar Doors, and went into Twin Towers here in downtown LA to do songwriting workshops with the guys, and then at the Linwood Women's Jail here. And I have to say that this is really intriguing to me, that most of the people we were working with were never exposed to this type of creativity in their communities. They had to be incarcerated to have, you know, music, the making of music brought to them in a way that they could actually participate. And it was so powerful what would come out of people, you know, when they started writing songs. Again, it just speaks to the power of music in terms of, you know, actually healing wounds, and the fact that creatively we're just not fostered towards creativity in America. I spent a lot of time in Trinidad, and Bob, we need to talk about the griot, chantuelle, calypsonian thing too, which Luc, I know that you love calypso music. But in a place like Trinidad, the moment you're born, you're just, you know, taught to be creative. You're around music and steel drums and making paper mache masks. And so Carnival is a year-round creative thing for everyone, from the street sweeper to the president, you know, and it really brings the community together. And hence it's a very chill community because everybody's making art and having fun. So, you know, that's a big problem for me with American culture, is that lack of creativity in our homes, in our spirits, in our communities, you know?
Yeah. And Calypso, you know, I mean, I first got interested in Calypso because of a record on Folkways called The Real Calypso. I don't know why they called it that. But it's full of these sort of talking newspaper songs from the 1930s, and you could track. I mean, there's a huge Bear family anthology called West Indian Rhythm, and you can track like every event of the World War II, just about through, you know, there's a song about Hitler invades Poland, there's a song about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, etc. And this was how news was conveyed. You know, it's ancient human tradition kept alive by Calypsonians.
Yes, and then in France, there were the troubadours, you know, Francois Villon and people like that, who were taking songs about news from village to village as well. And Bob, you know a lot about the griot thing.
Oh yeah, you know, I've been to Africa, you know, yeah, and that tradition, the oral tradition, how it works its way, and you know how hip hop is poetry is another story. You know, we're punk, but hip hop is right there, you know, too, during the time, and you know, the last poets. I mean, Luc does such an incredible job in talking about this crossover of poetry and rock and roll. You know, Patti Smith and Lou Reed, the Poetry Project, Rene Ricard, you know, are all great figures in Luc's books, and that that dynamic, that coalition of poetry and rock is something that you know, it was, you know, Richard Hell, come on, let's go. So that's the end of my story there. I don't know what I'm talking about. What did you say? We were supposed to talk about Trinidad Carnival.
Didn't you put a book together where you were translating griot?
I'm in my book, Sing This One Back to Me.
That's right, yeah.
Actually, you can see my choras back here. Are they showing up? The choras? Papa Suso left 2 of his choras in my house. We went back to Gambia. In the book from Coffee House called Sing This One Back to Me, which is what Papa would do. That's how it's passed. You play the kora, and then he'd play the kora, and then he'd hand it to me and say, all right, sing it back to me. That's how the transition happened. Transmission, and that's how it happens in the oral tradition. So in the middle of that book, there's like 20 poems from the Jalia griot tradition that have never been translated into English. They come from Mandinka and Fulani and some other West African languages, which I don't speak, but with his help, we were able to translate these.
Right.
That's my story about that. So there should be no conclusions here.
Oh, you know, I just wanted to mention, Bob, you had said that I called Toni Morrison an Afrofuturist. I actually posed that question because she's so enthralled with ghosts, and she writes about that, you know, a lot. And when we're talking ghosts, we're always talking about like snapping the rubber bands of time and space, you know. And so that was the context that I asked the question in. But I just wanted to mention there's a lot.
I was making hyperbole as usual. That's what I was giving you credit, kiddo.
No, thank you. But you know, there's a lot of Black female scholars that are writing about Black women in music right now. Great books like Well, Tasha Womack wrote about Afrofuturism, has a book about that. And Daphne Brooks, liner notes for the revolution, the intellectual life of Black feminism. There's Daphne Brooks wrote Black Diamond Queens. So we're fine, you know, it's all these books are coming out by Black scholars, and it's just so important and wonderful that we're seeing these books now, because these are histories that have been just kind of buried, you know, and it's all
and there was a
coming
whole
out.
time when, you know, in the 70s, for example, you didn't see a lot of Black writing about historical Black music because everything was moving forward and no
Right.
looking back to the time of repression. Now taking the historical longer view.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes. I have a friend named
great
Lene
thing.
Denise.
Yeah,
Yeah,
just
my friend Lene Denise is writing a book for the same series, the Music Matters series, about Big Mama Thornton. So it'll be why Big Mama matters. UT Press for this series, they're hiring a lot of women to write about women musicians and female groups, which is really great. Tanya Pearson's doing a book about Marianne Faithfull. So I just wanted to make people aware of the fact that this is a great little series of books as well.
So we're nearing our conclusion, I guess.
This is true. I do want to ask, I was promised that I would be told the story of the two photographs that you took together, the photograph that you did that has been confusing our team all week long.
Yes.
I would love to hear about this beautiful photo shoot with the tintypes. Are they tintypes?
Yeah, they're tintypes.
Can I just show
We
everyone?
brought in a tintype photographer.
There they are. Beauty.
Do you want to take that, Luc?
Oh, well, you could say it's our Marcel Duchamp as Rose c'est la vie moment, you know.
Yeah,
Or,
yeah, and me as a youthful Jesus Christ.
yeah, oh yeah.
Oh boy.
The very sensual Jesus Christ there.
Adam Driver could get the part.
Well, for me, it's all about gender fluidity and, you know, being able to play with mystery and flow and in terms of gender, and not, I've always kind of been adverse to slapping labels on my butt, you know? So it's very important to me to be able to be creative with my sexuality and my gender. And so that is the spirit of the photograph. For Luc?
And for Luc, it's, you know, it's a process of discovery. Let's just put it that way. I hadn't done that before. And anyway, I think I'll cut this short.
Well, and you promised to tintype me too, Adele. So I'm sorry I was late. I didn't get it.
Well, you sent me that beautiful drawing by Fong, and we couldn't do it with a drawing.
Oh, well, technology fails again. Good for you, Fong.
All right, well, I think that's a beautiful place maybe to move to audience questions. We've had a number of them come in. I do want to say the beautiful interview between Adele and Luc is in this month's issue of The Rail. I'll drop another link in the chat in a moment, but I thought it was a hoot to read, and it made me think a lot. We've been thinking a lot at The Rail this past 2 months about manifesto thinking and manifestos of the past, manifestos of the future, how every manifesto has its not just sense of politics, but like how its own way it imagines the world, right? It posits a future, and I just love this line, but we were not an organizing force of resistance, we were hooligans. We were the rats in the temple living off discards and invisibly undermining the structure. That kind of that cultural hooliganism, I just feel like it's the right ethic. So I wanted to say thank you so much. It's just been so fabulous to read. So our first question will come from Glenn Noirtier. And Glenn, you should be able to turn on your microphone now.
Cool. Hey, thanks. Thanks, Malvika. And thanks I'm Glenn Noirtier. Hi. You actually pronounced my name right. It's Finnish for campfire. And it happens so rarely. Anyway, I'm here from Ottawa, Canada. I'm part of CORT, the Ottawa Queer Arts Collective, and we're doing some programming on HIV and AIDS performance in the year. So my question was a question for Bob or anyone else who may know, and I'm asking from Ottawa. I was just thinking about Penny Arcade's comment last week talking about John Giorno and the end of lineage. And I'm just wondering, are there any slam or performance poets you can name or talk about who were lost to AIDS?
Well, you know that slam started in the late 80s, so it really, you know, there's a little bit of a gap. But one of the first people I knew who died of AIDS was a poet named Lobo, New Rican, and I think his name was Miguel Lopereña, but I could be wrong. Lois is on here. Lois, if you're on here, would you correct me there? But Lobo died of gay cancer, which is what the words were then for calling AIDS. He is the inventor of the Nuyorican chant that Miguel Algarin would use for the opening of all the slams and readings at the Nuyorican Poets Cafe. And of course, Miguel himself was HIV positive from a very early age. He just passed during the COVID, and I can name a few others, but I'd have to put my thinking hat on there, Glenn. But I'm so glad you're doing this. You know, and of course, there's David Wojnarowicz was a poet too. You know, definitely give ratings with him. He was not a slammer, but he was a performance poet in his way, of course. Anyway, we could talk more, but there's a few names for you.
Okay, thanks. And thanks again for last week's John Giorno. I know I'm cutting on it. I only knew John for, we hung out for 4 days while he was here for a performance. And so I'm still carrying the energy of that. So last week, it was great to see that others had felt that electricity as well. So anyway, thank you for today as well.
Thank you so much for your question. Our next question will come from the fantastic Susan Landgraf. And I know, Susan, you were dropping a couple of different questions in the chat, so really your pick.
Malvika, sometimes I have trouble understanding what you've said. I don't know whether it's your speaker or what. Could you just say again what you just said about the question I'm going to ask?
Sure. I said you dropped a number of questions, all of them fantastic, so it's really your pick. Whichever you would like to ask.
I just, the one that I just copied down, because I went back through the chat to remember, was, I think it was Luc Sante who talked about the chain of thought. I think that was, those 4 words came from you. And when I heard that, it just struck me as a very powerful image. And my question is, how is that chain of thought being generated now? We've been back through the 70s and 80s in New York City, and within a certain geographical location full of memories. But how is that chain of thought being generated now? And the example that came to my mind as I was asking that question is that it's happening here with the rail events. But this is, and I spend a lot of time going to different online events because I'm very interested in chains of thought. But this is the only place I've found that actually is creating a forum online for the exchange of ideas, rather than just the mouthing of ideas and ideologies, etc. And having been in the classroom with Zoom, I know of the potentials of this technology, and I'm just wondering, what have I missed that maybe other people know of how this is being used to create a forum for the exchange of ideas?
I just noticed, by the way, that right after I mentioned the invisible teenage telegraph, that Evelyn McDonald popped up in the comments and said, TikTok. You know, don't forget, there's more than one way to transmit ideas, and ideas in action frequently don't look the same as literary ideas, but they're ideas nevertheless. So I think that, you know, there's a great deal of nonverbal transmission of ideas going on.
Okay, so let's take TikTok. And we were all that age once, which has been demonstrated very clearly during this hour or whatever. And part of TikTok is an expression of what's inside that can't be articulated in words. And so it's coming out, and the visual, we're in a place right now where we have to start really reading the visual and giving the people who are visually articulate some of the language so they can communicate their ideas themselves without allowing the media to define it, which is what TikTok has happened to TikTok. Only the media has been defining it. So it's a much larger picture. And so my question, you seem to be an educator as well. How is that chain of thought being addressed by the society at large? It's a big, very big question. I ask big questions.
Yeah.
But I want to
I mean, the chain of thought, as it expressed itself in the past, was outside institutions. You know, it was outside the media. Obviously, I mean, the media was something foreign, but it was outside institutions. And really, I mean, there were centers like, you know, the St. Mark's Poetry Project, for example. It was a great nexus of the Lower East Side, which still is healthy and happy and thriving. But, you know, I think it's the same thing. I mean, I think the real discourse, to put it that way, is going on, you know, at this level that is outside the range of the media. You know, there's conversations going on among young people, and they're, you know, and when I've like actually been admitted into the presence of my students in a non-pedagogical way, I'm often surprised at what they're actually talking about. You know, it's like, it's not like reflective of anything that could be turned into a think piece for the New York Times. You know, I mean, every generation of youth, you know, we're all rats in the subway, and I think it's, you know, there's a whole lot more media and use and intervention and application now than there ever was, but I think the conversation is just as liquid and as far from prying eyes as it ever was.
Okay.
I think that's a beautiful answer. I will also say I don't want to age any of us, but my take on it is that I am at the oldest level of I still am too old to know what is going on on TikTok. So perhaps these are questions that have answers, and yet, you know, perhaps we're aged out of it. But I will agree. Like, I think a lot of interesting organizing is happening in these spaces, and, you know, fills us with hope. Our next question is kind of a congregate of a couple questions that have come in. We have a lot of young artists in the audience. We're wondering if you could share your advice on how to be kind of a young artist, a young punk thing, a rat in the subway, a culture maker, mischief maker, how to live a creative life, your advice that you have perhaps to folks who are kind of just starting out. And I also want to ask kind of what is the education you advise to such a person, and could you talk a bit about, you know, where you feel you learned the most, what were your greatest, you know, where did you get the learning that you carried with you?
Yeah, that's a tough one.
Thank you.
I mean, you know, for me, I'm always saying, I mean, I went through college, did not graduate, and then, much to my surprise, behind my back, I got my full education at the New York Review of Books. So learning on the job, I was like, feel like the last, one of the last beneficiaries of the, you know, the apprentice tradition, at least in the literary world, that way, that You know, I did not get an MFA, but, you know, I had this job and it taught me a whole lot, mostly because of my teacher. Yeah, you know, I don't know how to give advice on how to be a rat in the subway. I mean, I think, you know, whatever we learned during our time is, you know, a lot of that is inapplicable to today's world. It's much more expensive. There's so much more competition. On the other hand, you guys benefit from the fact that you, you're much more, you know, you've got this kind of organizational strength because you can link up with people in outer Mongolia and we couldn't, you know. And so you're very fortunate in that way. This, you know, if it happens in New York, it will be happening in Turkmenistan tomorrow. But I don't know, I always want to say to young people, well, you know, there's like cities and towns that are being depopulated all over the place. Why don't you take your 40 best friends and move out there? Start your own scene, completely independent of the power centers.
I totally agree with that, Luc. That's, you know, it's all about community and where you live and being able to afford to do what you want to do. In terms of art and music, you know, for young people, I would say, most importantly, don't play to the crowd.
Mm-hmm.
Don't do your work because you think a specific audience is going to like it or not. And I think in some of these social media spaces, there's a lot of judgment and a lot of like need to belong. When you're an artist, you have to be able to, you know, be authentic to what your inner life wants to bring out of you in terms of your specific vision. And that's so important. I often talk about this concept that Federico Garcia Lorca came up with called the duende, which is a little spirit that gets in through your emotional wounds, but you have to be vulnerable enough to let that in and then work with it and let it dance back out in whatever your work is, be it a painting or a singing or a book or whatever. Yes, I'd say that's the most important thing, is to not play to the crowd, to play to yourself, because that's where you will stand out. You know, I don't have an academic education. I often wanted one. I was like Jude the Obscure, pining for you know, a university education, but my education was all based in people and experience. And I think I was very fortunate as a kid that I was, you know, that I grew up in foster homes and reform schools, because I was in close proximity to people of other races that I would never have grown up with because of American segregation. So, so it's really about experience too, you know, and I've always loved to read. Reading is everything. Experience with other people is everything as well.
And also, I would say, well, that don't play the crowd reminds me of my favorite piece of baseball advice. Not that I'm a baseball player, and I don't remember who gave it. Some hitting coach advised his pupils, hit it where they ain't. You know, I mean, like, find the place where there are no outfielders, basically. You know, go there. But I completely lost the thread of what I was going to say. What did you end on? I don't know. I was going to say something about that. Whatever.
Just weave duende in there and you're done.
There you go. There you go. Mayakovsky, Bob.
Put your Mayakovsky on, folks.
Stand up on a couple boxes in the public square and spout your poetry, you know? That's what we need.
That's what we need.
Megaphones.
Yes.
More megaphones.
I love what's coming into the chat. There's so much good chatting, but it's be a rat, rat nation, you know, find your tribe, enter the world with a large heart. I can't say this part in Spanish, but it's about liberation of the animal.
Yes.
Our next question will come from Lois Griffith. And Lois, you should be able to turn on your microphone now.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm trying to be
Hi,
seen.
Lois.
Hi,
Hi, Lois.
Bob. Yeah, here I am. Yeah, I'm listening to you talk about the Lower East Side back in the day in the 70s and the 80s. And I was just here with my cousin telling him that dancing was everything to us, to me. And, you know, in the early years of the New Yorican, you know, we would have, especially in the old cafe, the drummers. We had, there was Stephanie Chapman, Eddie Conde, and Richie Cruz were our three drummers who would come almost every night that we were open, and we would dance and we would have Roomba sessions. I'm wondering how you see the connection between, because back in those days, when you say the rents were so cheap and you could live on a dime, the Lower East Side was a place where a lot of white people didn't want to come because of the drugs, because of, it was not an integrated community. It had not yet been gentrified as it's been gentrified probably since the 90s. And I'm wondering how you see, coming from a musical persuasion of, I don't know how to call the music that culture calls punk. It wasn't really punk here in New York. The kind of music that came out of CBGBs, the kind of music where you see people raving and dancing up and down. How do you see it intersecting with, particularly on the Lower East Side, where there was so much Latin music? You talked about walking along the streets and cars driving by. Well, they were blaring things. They were blaring Hector Lavoe. They were blaring Willie Colon. Fania All-Stars every August took over Madison Square Garden, filled to the rafters with the Fania All-Stars, Celia Cruz, Ray Barretto, who was a great supporter of the New Yorican. He gave us a drum. He used to come. We had New Year's Eve events. Ray would come to the New Year's Eve. You know, all these really fine, great Latin musicians. How do you see the intersection of it with the punk, or was there? And then two, I want to hear something about understanding of the poetry's intersection with jazz, because you remember when Steve Cannon, bless his soul, wherever he is, every year in August 2, celebration. Charlie Parker lived over across the street from Tompkins Square Park at one point. You know, he would have that festival. How does the poetry intersect with the jazz? Because I don't think you can negate the influence of the jazz on the poetry. That's not really a question. It's I wanted to hear your thoughts on such matters.
Well, I did see both Tito Puente and Ray Barretto at the Mud Club.
Perfect response.
And what were they doing?
No, they were intense. Those live in my mind. I remember Ray Barretto's piano, which sounded like as loud as any rock guitar I've ever heard. And it was, you know, the music was ambient. The street was hey. I'm sorry?
Ray was a conga man.
Wait, okay, who was playing piano then? Well, anyway.
It was Eddie Palmieri was big on
Eddie
piano.
Palmieri. Okay, that's what it is. I'm confusing. It's my aging memory, I'm sorry. And I was gonna say too that, you know, I remember there when Manhattan used to be filled with block parties, and it seemed like every block party I ever went to featured Johnny Colon and his orchestra. You know, like at the end of the street, they'd be on a riser. but the thing is, the musical influence, you know, the way the cross currents there were not immediately apparent. I think a lot of people, you know, had trouble with Latin time signatures, and you know, as opposed to like Arto Lindsay, who grew up in Brazil as the son of missionaries, picked up these Brazilian things and introduced them into the CBGB scene. I, you know, Puerto Rican and Dominican music was lagging in that regard. I don't know. I mean, maybe somebody in the audience knows of, you know, experiments that might have happened bridging the two, but I do not know.
Well, I can just say that the way you bridged those musics was you moved your ass from place to place, you know, and
No, but I mean,
Lois
yeah,
knows
yeah.
that you know, it's not that the musics did mix or that they should have mixed, you know, or that there was poetry with all of them, though jazz was the place where it was probably more at home. Punk gave, as both Luc and Adele have talked about, punk gave poets like Patti Smith, Lou Reed, etc., a place to go. But it was at Eddie Rodriguez's New Rican Village where I started hearing
Eddie Figueroa.
Eddie Figueroa's. Thank you. There goes the brain again. I'm glad you're here, Lois. Eddie Figueroa's New Rican Village, which nobody talks about anymore either. You know,
They had drag balls there, remember?
That was the beginning of, what's it called?
It was the Pyramid Club.
The Pyramid Club, of course. So that was the beginning of the Pyramid Club. Was Eddie Figueroa's drag balls for salsa. There's a lot of lost history, and all I can say is, Lois, as Evelyn McDonald has asked you to do in the chat, write the damn book. And because Luc and Adele have done, you know, I mean, we get the book. You read this sections of Luc's about dancing. I am dancing with you, and during those sections. So it ain't something to fight about, but it's certainly something to bring up and know. You know, like I lived at the New Rican Poets Cafe for years, and we had, you know, you danced or died between the sets there. That you had no other choice. And the sets were poetry, by the way.
Yes.
Yeah.
Love that. For our next question, we'll go to Larry da Silveira, also about dancing and dying.
Thank you. Thank you for this conversation. Both Luc and Adele, you're big inspirations to me. My question is not so highbrow. It's actually a pretty lowbrow question. And it's, are Jim Jarmusch and Sarah Driver good dancers?
Sarah is.
Okay, thank you.
All right, perfect. You heard it here first, folks. For our next question, I hope everyone's doing okay. Can we squeeze in 2 more? Is that all right? Okay, for our next question, we'll go to our very own beloved Nick Bennett.
Thank you, Malvika, and thank you, Adele, Luc, and Bob, for this wonderful conversation and this is an amazing archive of these histories, and I'm really happy to be here today. I have kind of a simple question for you, Luc. Saying you mentioned that you teach at Bard and that you were part of the Bard Prison Initiative. I was just kind of curious how that started, how you kind of became involved with the Bard Prison Initiative, and maybe how that sort of influenced your thinking on sort of creative output and culture in general.
Thanks. I mean, I got to admit, I conducted a couple of workshops at Greenhaven. I mean, 2 or 3. But I haven't really been a member of the Bard Initiative. Other people, and including, you know, I mean, most of the people who teach in the Bard Prison Initiative are full-time teachers there, you know, and so people who teach at Bard may put in guest appearances like I do. That's been going on since, I don't know, like 1993, something like that. And unfortunately, my memory is serving up the first name of the organizer. His name is Max, but forgive me, I do not.
Max Kenner.
Yeah, okay, great.
Max
And
Kenner started in 2001. Yeah, all he did for me was, I need somebody in the faculty to sponsor this, Bob. And since you know my dad and I know you, why don't you be the guy? I said, be my pleasure. And ever since, it's become, you know, I mean, there's a great documentary about it on PBS, and it's great to see, you know, Bard being a force in, but there's been those prison writing programs forever. Hetty Jones worked there, you know, in, what's the name of the women's prison? I can't remember right now. But at any rate, it's what poets do.
Hills.
Thank you, Lois. There she is.
And
Gave workshops there.
Go, Lois, go.
I was going to say the late, great Janine Palmy Vega, one of the very few women beat poets taught in the prisons for decades. And her memorial was in Woodstock at the Colony Cafe, and half the room was beatnik poets who were dressed like beatnik poets, and the other half were young men in suits. And they were the ex-cons that she taught, and they were powerfully moving. They cried, you know, they called her their mother. It was just like, I was in awe, you know, somebody who brought that much into so many lives. You know, it made me feel ashamed, actually, but no, Janine was a wonder. If you don't know her work, she was one of the first pocket poets put out by Ferlinghetti and the City Lights books. A remarkable person and not well enough known.
Really, absolutely. She, Bowery Books published her Somos Aquí poems by Spanish speaking, by immigrant farm workers in upstate New York, where she also had incredible poetry workshops. In that book, people were not willing to put their names to their poems, only their first names, because of being illegal immigrants. Yeah, Janine Palmy Vega, the Green Flute, wasn't that one?
Mm-hmm, that's right, yeah.
She's a marvelous, marvelous poet. Again, a woman during the Beat generation who, it's a hard time to break in as women, no matter what scene it was there. Not speaking for, but just saying that. Janine Palmy Vega.
Noted. And thank you all so much. For our closing question, we'll go to our very own publisher and artistic director of The Rail, Phong H. Bowie. And Phong, you should be able to turn on your mic at will.
Thank you, Malvika. Thank you, Luke. Thank you, Adele. Thank you.
Hi, Phong.
And thank you, Lois.
Oh, thank you.
Lois. I mean, absolutely, Adele should be, in the near future, be interviewed just by herself, you know, Bob, so that she get one of those portraits that I made.
Ooh.
That's why you want to get interviewed there for The Rail.
Oh, and then look separately. But this is sort of both of my question combined, but in a sense, it's all sort of bring up to this whole idea of cultural continuity. You know, I think that I just wrote in my editorial, somehow when education become a business and the whole invention of increased nursing home in America, the elderly generation began really separated from their grandchildren. The wisdom cannot be passed over. And I'm using that as an intellectual cultural metaphor. I was so lucky enough, Luke and Adele, when I came to New York, '86, I managed to meet Maya Leland Shapiro. And for every Saturday I go there, I had to read one book. And every Saturday I go there, I would meet Sir Isaiah Berlin. And the following week would be Barbara Epstein. The following week would be Irving Howe. The following week would be a young poet like David Shapiro. And then the following week would be Charles Rosen, who had lived as his tenant in the house, who was a music critic for New York Review of Books. It's so interesting. So I always had this incredible fantasy one day, if I can somehow, not to replicate, because none of us want to be nostalgic, but we still have to be mindful of history. History not only repeat itself, but can be helpful as an instruction. And I remember very clearly, you know, I taught for 16 years in graduate program in Bar, in Columbia, SVA, Yale, all places. And I know there's an incredible tendency among my young students to be conformists. They wanted to be told what to do. And I realized they all have this great desire to be specialists in one thing and only. They want to be successful in something. So they not really aspire to open up exactly what the word you just used, which I love, Vailoka, duende, mean vulnerability, and also it's also mean the soul. Vulnerability is the most greatest attribute and strength for self-knowledge. Without vulnerability, you only perpetually searching for answer. And that's not what art and culture is about. It's not about solution. It's not providing an answer. It's about adding to the question, you know? So that's what is so interesting to me, listening to Luc describing about Barbara, how learning from Barbara Epstein. And I remember in 91, I had a pleasure in having dinner at the Century Club, Luc, that George Braziller, who was my publisher, brought me there for dinner. And I had a dinner with Mr. Silver, Bob Silver, Barbara Epstein, and Cy Newhouse and Victoria Newhouse. And it was you know, I was a kid. I didn't know, I mean, I know who they were, certainly, but I have a few drinks and I make a terrible mistake by saying it to Mr. Silver, wouldn't New York Review of Books, sir, be called New York Review of each other's book?
Way to go, Fog.
No, I didn't say that in a very irreverent way. I say it in a very thoughtful way, but it was not enough. I remember he took my hand and yanked me in the corner and whispered away from everyone in the crowd, young man, listen to me. If you think one day that you grow up, if you don't help each other, your generation, among your friends, your colleagues, who would? You tell me. Here's my phone number. So he gave me his phone number. So that was a big lesson, huge lesson. And as for Adele, you know, your story about all the friends that you grew up with, especially with Nan Golden, I couldn't help but to think also that cross-pollination of that generation, that it was probably the last in the 80s. I couldn't help but think of Kibenberger, Martin Kibenberger, who was a good friend of yours.
Yes.
So I would like to ask two questions. One is your relationship with Martin Kibenberger, who I admire so much. And then again, just to follow the tail end, Luc, you can answer later after Adele about Mr. Silver. I mean, I know your relationship with Barbara now a little bit, but it would be great to hear a little bit of Bob Silver and certainly Elizabeth Hartwig also. So.
Well, on Kibenberger, he was coming to New York in the late 70s to the Mud Club, seeing what was going on, the films, the music, etc. I don't want to take up too much time, but he brought myself, Lydia Lunch, and Scott and Beth B over to Berlin to perform. And at that time, Berlin was very much more akin to New York City than London was, because in Berlin, they had that same cross-pollination. People were making movies and music and literature and poetry, and everybody was working together and collaborating. So it was a fascinating time in Berlin at the same time that it was in New York, and Kibenberger was our hero. He was a huge sponsor for all of us American artists coming over there. Luc?
Thank you.
Well, the New York Review of Books. My Virgil in the intellectual world of the 70s was my friend Darryl Pinckney, who was much more outgoing and with it than I was. And he became close friends with Elizabeth Hardwick and started bringing me over to her house. And the three of us would have dinner, get drunk, and then Lizzie would put on her Billie Holiday 78s, you know, wiping them on her butt before putting them on the turntable. And I heard so much gossip, you know, about, you know, New York writers of the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. Occasionally names still drift across my mind. I was thinking the other day as I was driving down the street, Bowdoin Broadwater. Whatever happened to Bowdoin Broadwater? Anyway, so in completely unrelated fashion, I mean, Lizzie was just an incredible influence. I was too scared to ever to be her student because she was so feared, and she taught fiction. And then as now, I have an uneasy relationship to the art of fiction. So I wasn't sure that I'd work in her class, but she taught me a lot anyway. I mean, a whole lot, including life lessons, not just about literature or writing. And then in unrelated fashion, a few years out of college, I ran into a friend of mine. I was working as a photographer's assistant, which was not a good thing. I ran into somebody I knew from Columbia who said, you know, I want a job in the mailroom. And he was working there. So I got a job in the mailroom. And then after a year, Barbara made me her assistant. And the division of labor at the New York Review, you know, they both edit. There were like assistant editors and associate editors, but they were basically glorified copy editors. Bob and Barbara did all the editing. And the division of labor between them was basically that Bob was the experts guy and Barbara was the stylists guy. And, you know, I mean, it drifted back and forth, of course, because Bob edited Joan Didion and Lizzie Hardwick, for example. And Barbara had her own slate of experts, mostly American historians, but that was the general division. So Barbara, you know, understood that, you know, I was interested in not being an expert, but rather, you know, taking a book as a jumping off point for expanding into some direction or other. And Bob, Bob was the experts guy. So after Barbara died, we had a slightly uneasy relationship because he kept trying to slot me into an expert position, you know, and no, I don't want to be your French literature guy. No, you know, but Bob was, you know, had, I mean, really like up until like 6 months before he died, he had the rosy cheeks of a newborn infant. I mean, this guy was so full of life, and his calling in life was to be an editor. And both of them, actually, Barbara too, but in a slightly different way. I mean, they were not writers. They did not want to be writers. They wanted to be the conduit between the writer and the page. And it's a noble, almost monastic kind of vocation, really, in a way, although they're both great social people too. And I mean, I'm incredibly privileged to have, you know, I never read the New York Review of Books before working there. I thought it was snooty uptown stuff, you know, but I soon realized there was a great deal more to it than that, and the best teachers I could possibly have found anywhere.
Well, thank you, Luc. That was beautiful. That was beautiful, Adele. I remember this is sort of my cryptic way to give Susan Landgraf a kind of an answer. I remember talking to Irvin Howe about his book, The World of Our Fathers. This is around 1990. It took me 2 weeks to read it, you know, and I'm learning more about the culture intelligentsia among the Jewish community, particularly, you know, City College, you know, look, I was learning more about it, but have a little rather complex question, the one that's similar to Susan just asked like 15 minutes ago. And I remember my Shiguro told me as I was walking out the door one Saturday visit, he said, Fong, here is Reed Horace Cullen. Here is the original of the Nation published 1915. and it's called Democracy versus Melting Pot. And I remember reading it, and it stuck in my mind. I still remember there's an incredible misunderstanding about this fragile democracy, that people think that we can just put in a melting pot and we assimilate. It's never quite true. I mean, if you think about Wisconsin, for example, why is it so many German who chose there, the immigrant? Why is it right below Minnesota would be Swedish? You know, you can say something about Boston being Irish, or New York, Lower East Side, Italian, whatnot. And I think exactly to the point where Lois asking, you know, your question was very important, Lois, you know, why is a block party in certain plain Lower East Side would be Cuban music and the other would be something else. You know, even though they might influence each other, but they never impose any kind of ideology or being told to assimilate. That is easy now. They were happy to do what they do and happy to jump on the next block when they feel like it, and vice versa. There's a right to be different. That's my point. And I think what I learned so much from that one reading, because every reading it was to be talk about the next Saturday, as if I'm getting a task, you know? But I remember coming away from that very Saturday was learning about the idea of individual being an instrument in a big symphony. Every single voice is unique, and it should be cultivated to that very uniqueness. But as a whole, they orchestrate a huge symphony, the symphonic sound, which is what referred to Emersonian, or even, you know, the last person who really advocated for this was Richard Rorty in that book. Remember, achieve the country. Remember the last line of in the book, the novel at James Bowen, the fire in the last fire. So anyway, thank you so much. It's to be continued, Bob. To be continued, Luc. To be continued, Adele.
Thank you, Phong.
Thank you. Thank you, Phong.
Back to you, Balvika.
Thank you all so much. As you know, here at The Rail, we always close with poetry. And as you also know, Bob Holman wears many, many hats. So Bob, I'm going to hand the mic over to you to close us out in style.
Wow. Okay, style it is. Well, you know, I take my my hint for what to read today from the themes. These are, I got some videos to show of what I'm doing right now, working with music. So first poem, I guess I should read a poem about the pandemic first. I'm going to do these little shorties. Pandemic shorty, March 2020. Ask not for whom the siren wails. That's you in there. Okay, great. I'll have more of those. But why don't you just cue up 96 Tears. And this is a poem from a short called Talking Pictures. The pictures are by Elizabeth Murray, who also did the painting behind me. We were married for 27 years. She died 14 years ago. And this is a dialogue I had with them when they were up on the walls, directed by Christy Zia. Push it back a little bit. Can you go back? Oh, that's fine. That's fine. Christy Zia, edited by Charles Custer Dutzik, who is a sensational editor and had a lot to do with this. And the music is by David Lang, who you all know. Okay, so let's hit that triangle there.
96 Tears. Jumping out at you is the giant heart of rock and roll. A big lime green square looks like a blank canvas or screen, which you can tell is leaping out because the 5 lime green lines of motion directly to the right of the green canvas, which is, of course, also the bottom of the upper left table leg. That's what's doing the dance. It's clearly dancing, dancing, dancing. Table legs akimbo. Do the limbo, do the twist, the cavort, the blister blast off. Plop out those sweat globules. Or maybe they are the tears That's right, there are 22 of them. So only 74 to go. Coming right at you, folks, this gallivanting tabula rosa symposia that has freed the purple planets from the galaxy of polka dots. Whipping, lashing, turning, crashing, jamming, ramming, winding up, winding down, flip, flop, and flop, flipping, flop, slopping, and just plain popping and rocking, corners, caroming and zooming. What I'm saying is curling the hurly, burling, flinging and zinging, can't miss but hit, never be done with it. All the way to the end of the song, 3 minutes, 6 seconds by Question Mark and the Mysterians.
That reminds me about, oh, thank you all. Well, Luc, I love the 12 sides in this book. Folks, you've never seen anything like this kind of writing. There's a 45, and you can see how worn it is, but you don't know how worn it is till you read Luc's description, which even includes how many times that record was played, who played it, and what happened. It's a brilliant, brilliant section. Imagination, this guy. Okay, all right, now that we're ready to set up, Malvika, how about we do Stay Awake?
When we put the girls to sleep, Elizabeth and I would often put on the cassette of Stay Awake, the Disney lullaby, as produced by Hal Wilner. We loved the perfect irony of Mary Poppins extolling the kids to stay awake when, in their consistent contrariness, that would lead them instantly to sleep. Or maybe it was Suzanne Vega's voice. Bonnie Raitt was on that album too. She was singing Baby of Mine with Was Not Was, which was the song that Dumbo's mother sang when little Dumbo was in her trunk. You see, that's the trunk curling there. The whole painting is a cup. And of course, there is a table on the cup. There's usually a cup on the table, but not in Stay Awake. The legs are laces and they curl up through all of the elephant ears and the cup handles, and Stay Awake is on your shoulder and you're playing a tune that will keep us awake all night in a dream.
Oh boy. We do miss Hal Wilner, and you know, he produced my first CD for Mouth Almighty Records, and was a good pal. And when he died, he's the first person in COVID I knew to die. It was, I don't think I have not recovered. You know, what a part of New York, as much a part of New York as everything Luc has ever written, which is everything. You know, Hal Wilner is right there in his equivalency love, you know. And by the way, Suzanne Vega, this is the surprise ending of Talking Pictures. At the end of under the credits, Suzanne Vega sings Stay Awake. Oh God, it's a killer, heartbreaker. And it was, you know, and Hal Wilner helped pull that off. We recorded it in the studio next to his office there in the music building. And that may have been the last time I saw Hal. I don't think so, but maybe. Okay, so there's another poem from the Pandemic Shorty series. Pandemic, March 2021. Why get out of bed? You're just gonna get back in. Okay. All right, now here's a poem that was made, you know, a little less than a year ago about what happened on the Bowery when all the boarded up buildings, well, you remember what happened. Let's watch the poem. Can you make the picture bigger and get rid of me? whatever.
Bob, I think there'll be like a little vertical line in the middle of your screen. You can just pull it over to the side and make the picture bigger.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
This is what democracy looks like. Murals on the Bowery. Bring back Bowery Project. Bleaker than bleaker. Barer than nada in Nadia. A plywood desert out my window on the Bowery. A siren of silence. Blind leading the blinder. Looters, cops, ruder brutes. Systemic collapse and a sick rose, slashed tiredness, buffeted by pandemic waves. Racism pulls nerves from our bodies using iron stupidity clips. Fascism allaying hot macadam on our wounds. The leadership, is tyranny. And then the artists got a hold of it. Sprung rhythm, art garden splash, walls blossom, Black Lives Matter. Many's the days and many's the ways and many's the time come before, as the dead and the dying and the violent lying wait covidly, patiently next door. The Bowery resurrects. Now there's a next. See, there's a lot more to go than's before, and the art that you see lifts infinity as you stop dead in your footsteps and roar. Up the ladder with the brush and rush. Yes, there's hardly a clown in the sky. Scooters punched them in their plywood nose, so stop your gab and chatter. Spell out Black Lives Matter. The flowers beckon, a good luck spot, I reckon. Emmett Till is still here. Dressed in colorful crack, a blessing for the homeless. Bowery Mission's sidewalk is tattooed with poem's shadow. No one shall utter the debt owed to wonder. All together now, call out the name. That's not anonymity's face on the wall of grace. George Floyd is breathing again. More art than's ever been seen before. It's a gift. It's capitalism's grave. There's no one to recall, bounce back from the fall into summer heat's saving grace. There is no justice in America, but it is the fight for justice that sustains you. Baraka says that crossed from his pad on Cooper Square. Hetty still lives there, and the murals that sustain us on the streets where we live. Individual power dies twice every hour to be born down in utopic Foley Square. I saw you on your bike with your mask and your strike and the placards that gleamed in the pools of your dream. Oh, artists, indefatigable rascals of love. The looters and shooters and dumbass computers lie down in the middle of the street. But BLM keeps on marching. It's the Bowery's fortune, and the past is the future again. Don't tell us what to do with the nail and the screw, with the paint and the roller, bucket and rags in a stroller. Dance on the graves of the rich and enslave those who'd profit from sweat that's not theirs. Lift your horn, lift your voice. It's for you. Make the choice. It's the people's history. Free art on the Bowery, the garden of power. Contemplation's bower, down on the Bowery, where art knows how to live.
How do I get, oh, there I am again. Hello.
There we are.
Yeah, so I have, then I'll conclude with the final pandemic shorty written yesterday. It happens every 100 years. Get used to it. Okay, thank you. It was been a great honor to be here with you guys today. Any questions?
Likewise,
No, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Adele, Luc, Bob. I really think you could talk us off the ends of the earth, and we would just keep following and following. And that last one was pitch perfect. Yeah, incredible. Yeah. Thank you to the three of you for bringing us this conversation, for opening up the space so beautifully, sharing so many insights about sort of the past and the present of New York. As always, we'll share the video of this reading on YouTube and our archives in a couple days, so it will be available if you want to revisit this magical space. And please join us again tomorrow when we're joined by artist Huma Baba, who will be in conversation with Art Historical Dream Team, Amanda Glubisi and Jason Rosenfeld, and that'll close out with a poem from Daisy Atterbury. That will be, as always, at 1 p.m. right here in the Zoom, and I'll drop a couple links. Other than that, thank you all so much for coming in, tuning in, and I'll invite you all to turn on your microphones if you'd like to say hello to one another or goodbye on your way out. But thank you all so much. This was really incredible.
Malvika,
thank you.
Do you have the link of the
Yeah, I'll drop it in the chat.
That dropped in.
Thank you so much, Luc.
Thank you. Thanks, Adele. Thanks, Luc.
Pal, I'm seeing your bedroom.
Bob.
You are.
Thanks for.
Thank you. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful.
So much.
Thank you. This was really great.
Good, Bob.
Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Lois.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Hey,
It was
Luc, how do you
wonderful.
pronounce your name?
See you soon again, dear friend.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. We have to do it another time separately with Adele.
Yeah.
So, and Bob and I can be co-hosts. I don't.
Hey, no kidding, Luc. Is there an accent over your E?
no, it's silent. It's not a French name.
I'm so sorry.
Is it just Flemish?
It's Walloon.
Walloon, pardon me. Luc Sante.
That's it.
What's the craziest pronunciation you've ever got for your name, I wonder?
Oh, you know, the Luc Santes, all this.
How about you, Adele? What's your favorite mispronunciation?
I would say Adele Bertei.
That
topped it.
Singer.
I got this album out to put on after, and I just noticed, Adele, you're on the back of it.
Yeah, no New York. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Thank you so much, Malvika and Fong. Thanks for having us.
Oh yeah.
Bob, love you guys.